I'm Henry Yu. I'm a historian at University of British Columbia, and so I'll be moderating panel two. It's Strengthening Social Fabric and Coalition Building Beyond Chinatown. So welcome, everyone. Bienvenue. We're, we have a wonderful panel to follow up, actually. For those who've been part of the conference online already and sort of heard from our panel one speakers, I think we've got a very nice segue that was given at the end of the first panel about hardware, software, and hardware. And I think this panel really is about hardware. It's about why do people feel tied to Chinatown, and what is it that makes them want to fight for Chinatown to actually protect it? What brings people together? So I will introduce the panelists one by one. We're going to go around. And we're all coming from different places. That's a wonderful thing about being able to do this online through Zoom. So I'm joining you from Vancouver, the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, the Coast Salish peoples that have been on this land and their territories for time immemorial. And we are uninvited guests, especially when we think about Chinese and other Asian migrants who came here along with European settlers. That we're uninvited guests on Indigenous land, and I'm just to for those of you who are not in Canada or from Canada, I'm wearing an orange T-shirt because tomorrow is Truth and Reconciliation Day, and the orange T-shirt symbolizes the losses that really were inflicted upon Indigenous communities through Indian residential schooling and other policies that were part of the Colonial Indian Act that we still operate under today. And so the ongoing colonial takeover and dislocation and appropriation in the place we call Canada now. So want to move it right away to now to the four panelists we have. The first to kind of share stories about social fabric and coalition building and just really community-based organizing is Jan Lee, who's joining us from New York, and she's been a lifelong activist, and multi-generation, in fact, has been doing this and has had really parents and generations before pass this on. So I'm going to pass it over to Jan Lee to start with sharing some of his story.
Thank you so much, Henry. I have a slideshow. I think we're going to have the ability to share my screen. Just a sec. And here we are. Can everyone see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, thank you, Henry. Neighbors United Below Canal and activism in Chinatown. I'm going to give you a very short history of my family in Chinatown. My grandfather, Lee Sing-Fun, arrived in New York City in the 1890s. Shortly after, he brings his wife over by way of San Francisco. These are the buildings that I live in. This was purchased by my family in 1924. It's still standing today, and although this picture is from the late 1930s, it looks pretty much the same. My father was born in this building. We had various shops in Chinatown, including a coffee shop and a gift shop. These were family shops that were started by my aunt and my father, and the gift shop on the right was my mother's. We grew up as a typical Chinese American family in 19 and 21 Mott Street. My father joined the United States Air Force, later becomes an aeronautics engineer, but at the same time managing properties. The reason I'm here today is to talk about what's happened in Chinatown since early 2018 and 2019. Our council member approved for our district the tearing down of 2 jails to build a mega jail. These 2 enormous structures that you see here are on the right, a building from the 1930s that was renovated only 40 years ago. The building on the left is only 40 years old. Both of these are currently being demolished. And here you can see a map showing the proximity of the low-income senior residence, which is actually located on the campus of this jail. And that low-income senior residence was fought for by the community, as well the health clinic, and to have the access to a roof garden. And you'll see in the middle between these two buildings an open-air plaza. To give you an idea what's at stake, this diagram shows what the proposed mega jail size can be. And this is an enormous difference between the old jails and the new jail. To give you a better sense of scale, this jail will probably be the tallest one in the world. A vertical jail is very unusual. It's actually going to be taller than the Statue of Liberty. Can you imagine this in the middle of Chinatown, in very dense Chinatown? And I want to point out, since we're talking about activism, this is not a new phenomenon for Chinatown. When the original jails that I just showed you were being built, Chinatown came out in force. 12,000 people marched in our streets. And the photograph on the right is a recreation of the marches of our predecessors. My group, Neighbors United Below Canal, organized a march and rally of 1,000 people. And you could see the similarity between the earlier protests on the same issue only 40 years earlier, and here we are today in 2019 in this photo, 2020. And isn't the same messaging happening? No new jails, fund mental health, fund affordable housing. This is the same thing that they were saying in the 40s, the same thing they were saying in the 80s, and here we are saying the same thing in Chinatown. We had to take an extreme measure, and that extreme measure of activism was placing our bodies in front of the bulldozers that were ready to demolish these jails. And we see this as an extreme form of protest, peaceful, but as you know, in New York, we're never quiet. So this was a very loud protest, but it was a peaceful protest. It resulted in us being arrested. We became quickly known as the Chinatown 10. The people who got arrested were a diverse group of people, between men and women, representatives of the LGBT community like myself and another woman. All of these leaders, community leaders, put themselves out there because we all are privileged individuals. We could take the day off to do this. We are healthy, we don't have criminal records, and we did this as a matter of our right to do it. Howard Huey, pictured here, is a co-founder of Neighbors United Below Canal. This woman, Grace Lee, has gone on to become our assembly representative. And of course, Evelyn Yang, whose husband ran for president and also ran for New York City mayor. We were able to get our voices out there because we utilized the partnership of such groups as Welcome to Chinatown, which is essentially younger activists, coalition builders, networkers, who are able to get the messages out there on social media. These photographs, the messaging was all very carefully tailored so that we could attract young people to this cause, and I think we were very successful in doing that. Sometimes using very unorthodox methods. Grace Young is a James Beard Award-winning cookbook author. Well, what does she have to do with jails? She took a very strong interest in this issue because she loves Chinatown. She has gone around the nation supporting Chinatowns. And we did a dinner series inviting her to be our host, to attract influencers like the woman you see on the left of the screen, to talk about the precarious nature of Chinatown's economy and what it means to lose a part of our food culture. This part of that movement led to an even larger rally within weeks of our mayor getting elected, Mayor Adams. And this one was double the last one, 2,000 people. And who you see on the screen is my other co-founder, Chris Marte, who became our council member. Diversity matters in activism. We know that the people who are most affected by the criminal, who have most contact with the criminal justice system in New York, are Black and brown men. This woman on the screen is Arlene Parks, who created from rubble, really, in the South Bronx, a thriving neighborhood. And just as her community was about to create a community center, the city came in and instead said the community center location will now be a jail. And she had to come and join us in Chinatown to say no more of these new jails. These are not the answer. And so reaching across to other communities is very important. Representation intergenerationally is very important. Thomas Sung is a local banker. His family is a small community bank. He put out the first amount of money to start the movement toward a lawsuit that we were going to organize against the city for the unjust way that they were moving forward with the process of the land use process. Even the people who were the architects of the entire criminal justice plan said these jails are too big, they're out of scale. Henry, how am I doing on time? I don't want to go over my time.
Finish up the slideshow. I think
okay.
I think we all want to hear.
All right, and so I just want to say at the end of this, we were able to generate a lot of news around this cause, which has many ancillary benefits. We're using the jail issue as a launching pad to talk about the economy of Chinatown, the fragility of Chinatown, the transportation issues in Chinatown, the elderly of Chinatown, the lack of housing in Chinatown, all centers around this major construction that's going on. And so this is the launching pad to start many other discussions. And I'll end at that point.
Thanks, Jan. And I know you'll come back to some of, again, keep talking about what's going on in New York. I think that's a great start for us. Thanks, Jan. And I think the other thing that we're going to be popping bios in to the chat for each person. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time introducing each, but Jan, thanks for introducing yourself so effectively as well and what's going on in New York. I'm going to pass it over to Stephanie Leo from Vancouver to share her story and what's going on also in her eyes in Vancouver.
Thank you so much for having me. My name is Stephanie, and I always like to share how I first got started in Chinatown. So back in 2017, a developer in Vancouver's Chinatown wanted to build luxury condos. And so my family was offered first dibs at picking a condo if we spoke in favor of this development. And at that time, I thought, wow, why not? Why not help Chinatown in this way? And I was so proud of my parents for being able to get into the market and be able to contribute back to the neighborhood. So I had signed up to speak, and little did I know there was such huge community opposition. And I didn't end up speaking that night because I realized that I clearly did not know what was going on the ground in the neighborhood. So from that point forward, I really tried to immerse myself in what was happening in Vancouver's Chinatown and learn about what the needs are of the living community. So many of the people here who at that time in 2017 protested this site. Since then, the city of Vancouver formed what was known as the Legacy Stewardship Group, which I was a part of up until recently. And for us, the culture and heritage of Chinatown is definitely worth preserving. And so I started the Chinatown Celebration Society. Earlier this year with UBC, the University of British Columbia, we helped to put out a report that they commissioned highlighting the needs of those in our community. 4,000 unit shortfall, really, affordable seniors housing. So that's anybody 55 plus living in the Chinatown and surrounding neighborhoods. So this was part of our campaign, 1,000 secure, 1,000 new. And for us at the Chinatown Celebration Society, what's really important in our vision is that we are spotlighting space activation needs. So whether that is festivals or things like housing insecurity in the neighborhood. This picture here is from our Fire Dragon Festival, which was held last weekend. We have workshops that run throughout the day, and this is one of them. This is a dumpling making workshop that we run alongside Yarrow Intergenerational Society for Justice, where we have seniors from the neighborhood come and make dumplings. This was hosted at the new Chinese Canadian Museum, and it was very well attended. After this workshop, seniors were able to take a tour of the museum actually in Cantonese and in Mandarin, and many of them remarked on how they felt very reflected and seen as they went through the museum exhibits. So as part of the third annual Fire Dragon Festival, we also have workshops, but because of weather, we ended up flexing from an outdoor space. So that space that I had shown in my first slide, right in front of 105 Kiefer, the Memorial Plaza, into the Chinatown Mall, which is seen here. So we had performances and workshops throughout the day, and it was really important to me to be able to activate this space. Reason being is because 3 months earlier, 60 seniors had come into this space trying to do Tai Chi and actually had the police called on them. So they were kicked out of this space. And since then, we realized that it is very difficult for people within the community to, one, access free public space, as well as go through the sort of bureaucratic hoops to be able to get things like permits to do so. So it was great that we were able to do it. But as you can see, the Chinatown Plaza, largely due to COVID, really isn't an active space. I would say it's 80% vacant. So the mainstay of our Fire Dragon Festival is our parade and ceremony. So it's great. We were able to have great representation from 3 levels of government, but also invite community partners who were there. The Fire Dragon that you can see in the foreground there is built over the course of a month with the community. So we found an accessible space that allowed for seniors to join us on a weekly basis to build this dragon made out of hay and stuff it full of incense. The result is this dragon that we parade through the streets of Vancouver. And here you can see it lit, all the incense lit up, and it's smoky. And despite being raining, we saw a lot of people from our community come out to celebrate with us. We were very intentional about ending the parade at the Chinatown Memorial Plaza. And again, this is right next to the 105 Kiefer development. So despite the fact that in 2017, this development was shot down by City Council, it was the most attended City Council meeting in the history of our city. The developer took the city to court essentially and rammed it down the throats of the city development process. And so it ended up being approved this year. So again, very intentional about activating this space because this memorial honors those who fought in World War II, as well as those who came here to build the railroad, like my ancestors. So I want to return back to where we started. For us, it's so important that we are continuing to activate space and ensuring that there are spaces available for the community to use, and that we're honoring that history of places like the Memorial Plaza. But in doing so, also not erasing the shared histories that we have with our neighbors. For example, like the Black community in Vancouver known as Hogan Valley. And I wanted to end with some questions that were actually posed recently by the WOW Project. So with their permission, I wanted to pose questions that they had for their followers on Instagram in response to a recent T Magazine article that was printed about their business and others in New York's Chinatown about how businesses can help to revitalize Chinatowns. And really, I think we need to highlight this moment for us in Chinatown with Fire Dragon Festival and question, how does the creative class play a role in gentrifying our neighborhood? We need to ask ourselves and be mindful about representation and go beyond things like the savior narrative and collectively ensure that Chinatown and its community is really what thrives. You know, we have a lot of things, a lot of activities that happen in Chinatown, but we need to question, who are they for? And finally, how do we build cultural power and craft and counter narratives against gentrification? Thank you, folks.
Thanks, Stephanie. So again, lots of interesting things going on in Vancouver, and lots of young leaders as well. And I think one of the things that we're going to talk a lot about is something that came up in panel one was the intergenerational as well as intra-community and intercommunity coalitions. Next, we have Fain Abhuani, who is part of an org, Brick by Brick or Brick by Brick, and really organizing for affordable housing. So I'm going to pass it over to Faiz.
Thank you so much. It's very humbling and frankly intimidating to be following the folks who just presented. I guess I could, for the benefit of the conversation later, I can talk a little bit about Brick by Brick and where we come from and how I guess we connect to the Chinatown Reimagined conference and all the folks who are here sharing their experience. So Brick by Brick is an organization that is based out of Park Extension, which is a very diverse neighborhood in Montreal, maybe like a half an hour drive north of Chinatown. And our stated objective is to build infrastructure for social change. And we focus a lot on housing and community spaces. Obviously, we have a broader vision, and like in the case of New York City and the struggle to stop the jail, for them the jail was kind of like a sort of like a way to organize around various different issues, intersecting issues. So for us, the catalyzing events were the development of the university campus in our area and the development of the AI sector in the neighboring area. And so in maybe about 10 years ago, the neighborhood started to change. Park Extension went from being a neighborhood that was plagued by really bad housing conditions to being one where the main issue was evictions. And we're still struggling with that. And this is an issue that kind of hits home for me because a lot of people in Park Extension sort of kind of look like me and sound like me. And what's happening here reminds me of what happened when I was a kid living just a little bit south of here in the neighborhood of Myland. And I saw how that neighborhood kind of gentrified, and my family in our community was the last one to be evicted from our street after the mosque closed, after everybody left. And I saw what happened in terms of some people, who were able to take care of themselves. Well, they ended up buying homes in the suburbs and their kids kind of lost their culture. And others who were not able to do so kind of got lost in the system and also lost their opportunity to benefit from solidarity that comes out of having a shared experience. These are all kind of hoity-toity ways of saying that what we're trying to do is to preserve diversity, because in our diversity here in Park Extension, I feel like there's a lot of the solutions to the world's problems. And so we're building affordable housing, and we're building an affordable housing project, and we also acquired a duplex that we transformed into a community center. And in that community center, we basically tried to do one very important and very difficult thing, which is to build community within diversity, which is such a great challenge, but also so nourishing. We speak 46 different languages in Park Extension. More than half of the population doesn't speak French or English. And so mobilizing is really a challenge. What we found is that the main issues that folks are struggling with are obviously housing, but also jobs, the language barriers, and basically access to services. So we've experimented with tons of different like programming. We have DJ workshops for youth. We had a daycare for non-status people. We have a support group for women in the neighborhood who are looking to like deal with their immigration issues. And the way that we organize really is very experimental. We work with other organizations to make sure that we're only addressing those things that they are not able to address. And that means that we largely don't do service provision. We do mostly quote unquote empowerment or confidence building work. And we try to reach people who don't have the confidence or the I guess the connections and don't reach out for help. And we do that by going door to door, which is an unbelievably expensive way to do outreach, but it's also we found like in the longer term just the most impactful. So I guess I'll leave it at that, just to give you a little broad idea of like how we're doing what we're doing, but I can get into like how we finance all this and how we build relationships with other organizations. Because at the end of the day, I think what we're doing here and what folks in Chinatown are doing eventually is going to have to lead to a larger movement because the underlying issues are systemic. So, yeah.
Thanks. Great. I think we are already lots of strands or that we can pull on are coming up. So thanks for that presentation. Andrew Leong is next, who joins us from a long time as an activist in Boston, Chinatown, as well as teaching and being a lawyer association at UMass Amherst. So I'm going to pass the window over to Andrew.
Henry. Just very, very quickly, I immigrated in the late 60s and lived in Chicago, Chinatown with my grandfather, who was a leader within the merchants. And that was my obvious connection to Chinatown. And by the time I got into law school, I moved to Boston. And this was in the early 80s where we saw a multitude of various different issues that were impacting Chinatown, where institutional expansion was happening, where the Tufts University, the New England Medical Center, they were all taking over a lot of the various different land, a lot of the various different buildings that used to house garment factory workers. And we're displacing people, displacing small businesses, displacing residents. And so during law school, one of the things, and immediately after law school, I engaged in practice within legal services, which is providing to the indigent civil service needs, okay, for our community in Chinatown, which means dealing with anything that was non-criminal, whether it was divorce, abuse prevention, unemployment rights, and or eviction. And so this was what we saw, that people in Chinatown were being displaced. And so coming out of that particular experience of working not just the defense against evictions in Chinatown, as well as an adjacent community called the South End, it allows you to understand the more systemic global issues at hand. And so that was one of the reasons why some of us started working in conjunction with various different progressive organizations to deal with these issues, not by individual, eviction by eviction, which would get you nowhere, right? But to deal with it insofar as public policies coming out of City Hall and the various different boondoggle and corporate welfare, essentially, that City Hall would allow for developers to build whatever they want to at the expense, really, of our community. Okay, so we saw it time and time again, whether it was Boston, whether it was San Francisco, whether it was Philly, even New York, where urban renewal and Montreal highways would come in and carve up our land, our community, displace us. And, we didn't have any particular voices because, we didn't have political power back then. And with that, we have remnants of what communities that exists. And so it's the same thing, it's the extension of all that we saw coming out of, the urban renewal time period during the 40s, 50s, 60s. And so, for instance, with Philadelphia, 20 years ago, we defeated an earlier iteration of a different stadium proposal. And then we defeated another proposal calling for casinos there. Now, you have this new stadium development without any tax dollars whatsoever, right? And so that's why City Hall is like not blinking whatsoever. Can we fund this? Can you imagine the tax dollars that we're going to be getting, the revenue, right? But what is the impact? Again, back to Chinatown. Okay, in all Chinatowns, we don't have the luxury because we are always located in the center city. On a historical basis, we always were the dumping ground. We had the cheapest real estate because it was the most undesirable place. And that's why they left us alone. Okay, so now all of a sudden, when land become desirable, okay, it is too valuable for the Chinese to live in. Okay. And so I think these are the kind of themes that we see over and over again. But one of the things that I do want to address is in particular to this particular panel, is why we have to go out externally to empower ourselves. In many ways, we do that because most of us that are working in these particular issues are disempowered, are disenfranchised. Most of the time, we're engaging in these particular local politics where City Hall has already bought off internal community organizations, right, in favor of whatever the proponents want. We know what's happening with the stadium. I mean, not with the stadium, but with the jail in New York City, right? If we give you a couple $1 million, you're going to be in favor of it, or at the minimum, don't talk crap about the jail, okay? And so these are the same things that they try to play people off of against each other in Philadelphia, in Boston, and elsewhere. And so for the progressive voice to be heard, we have to organize, and we have to deal with it in a situation where it's not just, the young folks, but I'm sorry. Hang on for a second. Forget about it. Too much technical problem. I was going to show you guys this iconic photo that you could probably see, with this, little old lady, 1994, in the middle of a particular protest. She held this megaphone that was all busted up. And so in many multiple publications, if you look online, you would see this little old lady with, gray, white hair. That takes time for us to educate, in order to actually, well, thank you. Now go to the second photo. Thank you. So this tells you that behind this little lady, there were other activists, there were other elderly that needs to be educated. And it takes so much time and so much effort for us, meeting after meeting after meeting. And so for some of us that are activists, many times, I would say to myself after a tired night of community meeting, bilingual meeting, me being a lawyer, explaining various different things, you ask yourself, why in the world are you doing this? These elderly folks are just sitting there. They're not doing anything. And not with this particular struggle, but another struggle where they were going to build an off-ramp into the residential part of Chinatown that would mean like something like some outlandish, like 50,000 vehicles coming into the residential part of Chinatown. The proponents, the state had this meeting, and all of a sudden, in the back of the room, this little old lady raised her hand. She spoke in Cantonese. And she says, if you and your bulldozers come in, I will be the first to lay my body down. And it's at that moment when I'm like, oh my God, crying. This is the reason why we do what we do. This is about community, okay? And, so don't think that you are wasting your time. Third picture, please. Don't think that, you're wasting your time when you're talking with the elderly, okay? As well as looking at the other end of the spectrum as well, that making sure that, we have space, that all the activists don't always hog the time. You will see me here behind this little kid. I don't have the microphone, okay? This is what community empowerment should be about. This is how I go about practicing community lawyering. And so these are the things that reverberate, that we try over and over again, that to make sure that, we have our present generation of elders, right, that are engaging with us, but at the same time, on the other end of the spectrum, making sure that we have a new crop of people, the younger folks, in order to take over that mantle for the next fight. And additionally, to make sure that we go outside of Chinatown. And so for various different struggles where we engaged in, we brought in not only communities of color, other communities of color that were impacted, but we also brought in various different environmental group, transportation equity group, the the bird people, all of those various different players that have different interests can come together if you're able to figure out what the pieces of the puzzle, are, and not only think from a Chinatown-centric, just the Chinatown box type of a deal. Thank you. Screen back out first. And so I'm going to leave you guys at that to make sure that we understand that things must be done on a much more holistic basis, and that community activists need to work in tandem with community lawyers, right? That it is through a multi-pronged type of a strategy that we're able to hopefully defeat some of these various different major developments that are going about erasing, all of the Chinatowns on the planet. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. And lots of points that you made that maybe I'll kind of echo a couple strands that came up and put it back out to go around the table again, so to speak, of the four of you. I mean, we heard in the first panel a question about museums, and one of the answers was both the education function, but also just the heart, like a feeling of being recognized for communities that have been marginalized, voices that had not been heard. But something that's come up really in all your comments is just this sense of belonging. It's about an emotion rather than even rational arguments, and who belongs and who's being displaced, who really doesn't have the voice to stop it by themselves. And so maybe I'll kind of throw out sort of, there's often abstract terms like diversity or coalition building, intergenerational, that often without a kind of explanation as to what it is that needs to be fought, and why. So I'm just going to throw that back out in some senses. Why is it so important that Chinatown's not just for the Chinese or something like that? I've heard that phrase, is Chinatown for the Chinese, but in some sense, all of you are saying that that's not going to work. So I want to go back to Jan, and then when we go around in the same order, just thinking about that role of the heart and of emotion, and to Jan.
Well, I think that the reason we have Chinatowns all over North America is because the Chinese immigrated to North America early on, and were able to establish a labor force. But it doesn't stop with the Chinese existing as a monolithic group. As you know, the Chinese are not just the Chinese. There are so many different people who have come from different areas, from Southeast Asia who are Chinese, and from Hong Kong and from mainland. But it also represents as a symbol, wherever we exist, as a safe place for the entire AAPI community, that we exist for Filipinos, for Japanese people, for Koreans. And in fact, in our New York City Chinatown, we now have Japanese and Korean restaurants that are actually thriving. We created these spaces that allow other people who look like us, who may not speak the same language, but also share much of the same identity with us, uh, as a safe space for meeting, for getting to know each other, for shopping and commerce, but also we're a very big, important part because of the way that we produce our commerce, like fresh fruits and fresh vegetables in open air markets that the Caribbean Black community shops in Chinatown, at least here in New York, that the Puerto Rican community down the block from the Smith Project shops here in Chinatown. And so when you affect Chinatown, you don't just eliminate the Chinese, you create a vacuum for many, many, many diverse groups of people. And some of that can be advanced, as we're hearing on this call, with development, with bad land use processes, with corruption, with gentrification by not only other corporate Chinese companies that may come in from a global standard and wipe out some of our mom and pops, but also the alcohol industry that comes in and uses our background, our faces, our identity to exploit us for selling overpriced drinks. You know, that's a common thing that's quite insidious in many Chinatowns.
Don't forget about predatory casinos, man.
Yes, and so, you know, our mayor here in New York City is trying to put a casino here. There's many health effects regarding gambling and alcohol consumption, and oftentimes those things are targeted to communities of color. This is prevalent throughout history. And so we have to push back, we have to organize, and we have to engage with lots of people to understand, or to make sure that people know that you're not just destroying the Chinese community and our culture by eliminating us. With that comes many, many, many other people that get affected every time a Chinatown is made smaller or diminished in any way.
Thanks, Jen. And Steph.
Yeah, I think in Vancouver, at least, a lot of conversation still needs to happen within the community about anti-racism and how sometimes anti-Asian racism and fighting that can sometimes be very exclusionary and leave out a lot of sort of common voices. So, for a long time, the city of Vancouver was dealing with the area of Chinatown in very separate parts. So speaking to just the Chinese community alone, and then speaking to the historic Black community separately. And so we were very much kept apart in discussions about areas that were going to be potentially developed within Vancouver's Chinatown that would affect a large swath of people, but really ended up these conversations that the city was holding, erasing and affirming for the maybe older Chinese community who didn't want to recognize the historic Black community, affirming for them that the Black community never existed, or because they weren't landowners, that they weren't there. So I think it's so important that we are having those internal dialogues, whether it's with fellow community stakeholders, landowners in your community, or it's even with your own family, to be honest. And making sure that everyone knows the history and that we are ensuring that conversations we have with municipal bodies operates and happen in a very fair way, so that we're uplifting all these voices, because really it's the same struggles that we're all facing.
Thanks, Stefan. Please.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really complicated problem. I feel like when I try to think about like what's the vision, like what's really inspiring about bringing different people together, I sometimes kind of still get stuck in the outcome. So in like a particular campaign or seeing people on the street, and I think it's okay for me to be inspired by that kind of like deep social change, which symbolizes like resistance to capitalism and to like colonialism. But at the same time, I feel like what really moves things along is having conversations with people who maybe don't have that same vision, or who haven't thought about things that way, who don't have that language. And to really center like listening, because I feel like a lot of times we just had a public conversation recently at the community center. It's one of the programs that we offer. It's we think about what's really heated in the neighborhood, and we just make space to talk. And right now the big controversy as banal as it may seem, is a bike path. The neighborhood, the city's leadership in the area recently turned over to a kind of like a greenwashing party, and this has sort of like made it so that anti-gentrification activists and climate change folks or whatever, young people, young educated, say white people, are on one side, and then you have like diverse, longstanding, family-oriented local residents who are like basically on the car side. And we feel like the way that the conversation has been going is not constructive. And so I, was hosting this conversation, and I just made space for people to speak up and to be heard, which is something that the mayor wasn't able to offer. I know this seems like a sideline thing, but the point I'm getting to is that while like hosting that conversation, I proposed, and I came to realize that people are not against each other. They really just don't feel heard on both sides. And sometimes most of the time policies benefit like developers and capitalists and whatever. But sometimes, policies will inadvertently benefit like the little guy. And I feel like we should focus more on like who's making the decisions, who's at the table, what are the democratic instances, and how can we like institutionalize these conversations, rather than constantly have to mobilize and start from scratch every time an issue comes up. Yeah, and I think that's something that we can learn from each other about. I certainly am learning a lot from you all.
Thanks, Andrew.
I want to go back a little bit with Jan's comment, because I'm a historian of anti-Asian violence, but also an attorney to deal with address some of the victims' rights as well. But we know that all Chinatowns are sanctuaries, okay? And in particular with North America, we see in the United States with the kind of anti-Chinese happenings, the massacres that drove people out of Rock Springs, Wyoming, out of Portland, out of Seattle. Where were they going to be forced to get onto boats to go to? Back to San Francisco, Chinatown. Okay, and so we know this is how the formation of ghetto happened. In, I believe, 1943, when Robert C. Weaver, the first HUD secretary, African American, that wrote the Negro Ghetto. He said in that wrote in that first chapter, okay, the first ghetto is not black. The first ghetto were Chinatowns, and white policymakers learned that if we could do it against the Chinese in Chinatown, we can do it to all the black folks. And that's how the formation of black ghettos occur. Okay, so what that informs us is the kind of violence that was perpetrated against the Chinese, against Asians, that drove us back into the crowded ghettos of Chinatown. Okay,
and I'm sorry, Andrew. I would just say that I would follow up with the fact that as blacks gained wealth and created neighborhoods that were self-contained for blacks, that threat became very real, and black communities in New York City were very quickly squashed down and eliminated quite violently. And so I think that, as Henry had brought up at the beginning of the program, that similarly, as Chinatowns progressed and advanced and improved the land and improved the commerce and improved the infrastructure ourselves without help from the cities, now it's time for us to be pushed off of this land. And so you started off also, Henry, with an acknowledgement to the Indigenous people. We see it first with them. We see it with Black Americans, and then we're seeing it with Chinese Americans throughout the North Americas, that as we improve things, the land oftentimes that used to be undesirable is often also situated in downtowns. And as the downtown areas become very valuable, it's time for us to be pushed off. And oftentimes land use processes can advance that very quickly.
the thought here is that we define anti-Asian violence too narrowly, to only these incidents that we see, But when urban renewal happens, and or even before urban renewal, when LA Chinatown was displaced by Union Station and had to be forced to move, when Chicago Chinatown was forced to move, when DC Chinatown was forced to move, these are incidents of anti-Asian violence. Okay, and this is why we mobilize in order to keep our identity. Who is Chinatown for? It's not just for the Chinese. Okay, it is for those folks that identify as Asians, right, and feel that sense of sanctuary, that mental security when we are in Chinatown, that this is home. Even though I may live somewhere else, this is home. I don't need to explain my Cantonese, my Mandarin, my Tagalog, my Korean, my Japanese to anybody. Okay, this is home. This is belonging, and that is very, very important. That's the reason why we fight for it. And even in places like Salinas Chinatown, where it's essentially a dead Chinatown, but folks there, not just Chinese, Japanese, Chicanos, okay, they're all fighting in order to rebuild Soledad Street so that we can have a Chinatown museum, because they understood that this place was not just for Chinese, it's for all people that were disenfranchised, that was physically on the other end, the other side of the railroad tracks, right, because of City Hall discriminatory policies. So these themes are reverberating with us over and over again from one city, one town to another.
Thanks, Andrew. And I wanted to kind of take something that all of you said, is the pitting also, and why we know that in 2020 and onwards, there's this spectacular anti-Asian violence that brought a lot of people into an awareness of the history. Perhaps they thought that living in the right neighborhood, driving the right cars, having the right jobs was going to protect them, but the spectacular nature. And I think this comes back to something Faiza and the idea of refuge and sanctuary is like, coalition building is very difficult when there isn't a spectacular crisis. But in some sense, many of you talked about the need to have those relationships, to be listening to each other outside of spectacular moments. That, in fact, that's where coalition building and reaching out and building trust and listening to each other so that you're ready for that spectacular moment. In the first panel, there's this a discussion about, Montreal Chinatown, the working group was able to bring everybody together so quickly in 2 years. And then there was a reminder that actually, no, it's been ongoing for a long time. And you can only, in some sense, be ready for those almost moments of crisis and opportunity to get a message across if you're ready to already with some organizing. So I want to kind of maybe poke a bit more about that as this idea that you need to have those safe spaces to create those conversations. Something that, again, Faiz, you mentioned very specifically about them. So I'll throw that maybe a little bit out to everyone to kind of talk a little bit more. Faiz.
Yeah, this is the stuff that gets me going. Oftentimes I'm asked to talk about the issues and I'm so over the issues. I'm all about process now. And I think actually I think one of the reasons why I was invited here is because I guess Jessica Chan met up with me and we started talking about, what happened with the Chinatown, the working group here. And when I heard the story, I was completely blown away. And all my questions had to do with like, okay, how do you get people to every week to show up every week and talk about this? I feel like, and I was just talking about it with my colleague and co-organizer, longtime co-organizer friend Sophie this morning, which is, how do you balance like working on the issues and getting stuff done, talking about resources and resource allocation and financing and all the hard stuff of organizing, And then relationships. And she always brings me back to, you cannot sacrifice relationships in order to get things done. And your posture vis-a-vis people that you are in a vis-a-vis people who are in a position of power is really like it's poison, actually. The posture of having demands, the posture of having clear asks, the posture of having a very clear, coherent narrative, which wins battles, is not the way that you need to be working with your own people. And it's such a tough thing because you have to do both that campaigning work and the governing work, the internal governing work, which has to be very democratic. And you have to keep asking. In my experience, I have to keep asking myself constantly, what what is the person that I'm speaking with, what are they not saying that needs to be said? And what are they, I guess, what are they saying that I'm not hearing? There's so much openness and vulnerability and just a sense of possibility and risk taking that needs to be engaged in if we want to work better within our groups and between our groups. Really make time. One of the reasons why coalition building is so tough is because everybody is busy. Everybody is so busy. Everybody is burnt out. Everybody is overdoing it because they want to see the results. And always coming back to the idea that, yes, you will get the results. Trust the process. That's the main thing for me,
I think one of the things phrased is the burnout is real, and that is one of the hardest things that us as organizers have to deal with. But the relationship that we have within language media is key. I think if you can engage with media folks who want to follow your story, who want to know the other angles that you're talking about, the hidden stories behind the main headline, is how the story stays alive. And oftentimes we find that really, really qualified Asian American reporters may not have the best English language skills, but their stories are diving deeper into the real human stories within our communities because they have the language access. That's where the mainstream media tends to fall down. They don't have the access and they refuse to do the deeper work because it's a lot of work. And so I think that there needs to be recognition, and perhaps now we should be able to have platforms that enable immediate language translations at a very, very high level, especially with AI now, to get those stories out into the media. One of the things that we've worked very hard with in the last, I've worked very hard with in the last 20 years, but on the jail issue, is working with in-language media that can really interview seniors, interview children, interview people that are just lost in the conversation with the regular media.
Thanks, John. Stephanie, yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to reference sort of the divide that we're experiencing in our community, going back to 105 Kiefer. So again, this luxury condo development. And back in 2017, there was broad consensus within the community against this development. And then this year, when the development application came back to the city, and we were, now I'm this time on the right side, fighting against it. It was unfortunate because 6 of these sort of legacy institutions ended up supporting the project. So it caused a lot of heartbreak actually in the community and a huge divide. And part of it is generational, but also this sort of political shift and I think way that some people view Chinatowns through revitalization and through condo developments, thinking that there's a term that sometimes gets used in Vancouver, bringing warm bodies back into the neighborhood. So it's unfortunate that we, I think, view our neighborhood in this way and with those words kind of dismiss all the work that is going on the ground, coalition building with other communities and really with the seniors who are in the community and the ones who are always at the very front of the line fighting against projects like this and trying to make their voices heard. And I think we have to recognize that it's difficult for them. It's hard for them, seniors, to, through language, fight through city bureaucracy and through accessibility, be present at demonstrations or space activations. So I think for us, we're trying to work through as a community, how do we build that relationship and repair that relationship with those 6 legacy organizations, and try and understand what it was really that made them flip from being against it in 2017 and now, unfortunately, supporting this project.
I was going to say, even terms like legacy organizations or all of you have talked actually some about history, and maybe because I'm a historian by training, that mobilizing the past is in some sense also a way to fight in the present, and I'm very cognizant that when in the Vancouver case again, because it's the one that Stephanie's just raised, that claiming the past and a kind of you're the exclusive interpreter of a certain past. I mean, not all of those 6 words were that old, to be honest. And so Jan, I know that you've talked about these multi-generation and long-standing fights, but the past, like how have you seen that used?
I think some of the stereotypes that are out there, and all of us in Chinatowns, wherever we exist, the stereotype that has been prevalent throughout history is that the Asian Americans are very docile and obedient, and they won't protest, and therefore you could foist these unwanted land use issues upon them. And actually the opposite has been true. Because we have protested, it doesn't mean that, let me rephrase that. We have protested and we've used the law. And Andrew knows that all across North America, we have really understood the law, became lawyers, used the law. Oftentimes it doesn't get reported on, and that's deliberate, right? We don't want them to you don't want them to be the empowered group. You want to always keep them in this stereotype. That's what we take to the streets. We're in the position right now where we told the mayor of New York, you either give us a seat at the table on this jail thing, or we're going to take to the streets once more. You have to back up your request with action. And there's an extreme version of protest, which is getting arrested. I find that to be a very extreme way to get your point across. But also, you can use your dollars in your pocket to be an activist. You don't have to be out there, doing what we've done. But the commerce and the way that you spend your money, don't spend your money with institutions and don't spend your money with exploitative businesses that come into your communities, or don't spend your money with people who don't support local Chinatown communities. That really matters very quickly. And one of the most important things I think that we could start to coalesce around in this century is the digital footprint that we all must create for each of our Chinatowns. But the digital footprint has to encompass all of us, talk about our issues so that we could understand in 24 hours something that's happening very quickly. The area of Lahaina in Hawaii should be important to us, because that is the state in America that has the largest number of people who identify as Asian American and Native Hawaiians. And they are in trouble. They're in trouble because not only have they suffered deaths, they're in very, very precarious situation about mass displacement of Asians. When have we seen this before? As Andrew brought it up before, all across the western part of North America, we have seen massive displacement of Chinese. We're going to see that again in Hawaii if we don't stand up. But we all have to stand up together, because a mass displacement of Asians in Hawaii, in an American state, is a real message to all of us. They can put highways through our communities. They can put jails in our communities. All of that leads to displacement. So I think that the digital footprint, to understand what's happening at any one time on the East Coast, the West Coast, even in Hawaii, will empower all of us to act very quickly. We can't go to Hawaii to protest with the Native Hawaiians and the Chinese and the Japanese that are there and the Filipinos, but we can support them digitally. I think that can be the way that we really hold politicians accountable and say, how dare you try to displace these people? So I think that's one of the things that we would like to work toward.
Thanks, Jan. Faith.
Yeah, I mean, just to bounce off of Jan directly, a couple of things. One about the consuming. I would just add one thing to the consuming, which is investing. One of the reasons why we were able to like I guess like our model or whatever rests on this tool called the community bond. And I'm very eager to like develop that in order to offer people who have like savings to be cognizant that when they put their money in the bank or when they put their money in an RSP or a mutual fund or ETF or whatever, that part of that money, a good part of that money actually finances developers who are able to build towers in our, central districts in Chinatown with like zero money down. It's crazy. Like the incredible like privilege they have because of these like investment funds. So the way we were able to get our duplex was by selling these community bonds, which are just like little investment tokens that we use to buy our property. And as our property gains value, we can then pay people back, which we just started paying people back this year, actually. So that's one thing I would say, like we're going to be rolling out another product like that soon. And we want to be able to make that available to other groups. So keep your eyes open. I feel like we're discussing, it's on the down low, but you might see something happen in Chinatown and Montreal that could serve as a model for Chinatowns everywhere in terms of like building community land trusts and getting like collective ownership going. So that's number one. Number two, about the digital footprint. I've thought about this, because I'm like, yes, community organizations don't leverage technology enough. We have to do something. And all the activists look at me being like, is this more Fai sellout stuff happening? And the thing that I'm scared of, because maybe I don't understand, so maybe I could get a clarification on that. But when we engage technology and social media specifically to mobilize, we're also getting people on the platforms. We're also getting people more dependent or using the platforms. And then we're competing with like big influencers and other groups and kind of holding people up. And one of the things we found doing door to door is a lot of people are isolated. And the reason why they're able to sustain that isolation is because they're on the machine, they're just swiping. So what do you think about that?
I think that we were able to, I can only speak for like a really hyper local level. When we started to engage with some of our local groups that exist online a lot, we were able to get our message out very quickly. These are complex issues surrounding criminal justice, surrounding whether or not the building of an infrastructure around criminal justice actually improves the people who are affected. We had to distill that down to talking points, but as you say, people swipe. And if you have a call to action, which means show up at 3 o'clock on a Sunday, that's where the power came in, where we were reaching people who have a burning desire to do something, but they need to be directed. They need to be directed in their language. And that visual representation of what our issues are, quickly get it across, but then follow up by having the in-person show up at 3 o'clock for the rally, show up at our press conference. We had press conferences that exceeded 150 people because they knew to be there at 3 o'clock on a Sunday. At the same time, the digital platform has been used against communities in New York City when they used COVID to hold quote unquote community meetings, and they extended that way beyond the need to do so. And that cut out the people who are disabled, the people who don't have computers, the people who don't have technology at home, the people who don't even have internet. Government was using that against us. And so it's a double-edged sword. I agree with you completely, but we have to have that delicate balance between holding our government accountable and say, okay, it's time to stop. You need to either move to hybrid meetings or in person, and at the same time, we're using technology to attract younger people who ordinarily wouldn't go to a meeting. So there's a delicate balance there. I agree with you completely.
Yeah, so I mean, at the same time that we talk about a digital footprint, we have to also be cognizant of the digital divide, especially for our, elder community members, right? And
Although I will
other,
say this, a lot of elders use WhatsApp and WeChat, so that is a way that we have yet to utilize. You have to be
but
very
it is
Chinese
exactly what
proficient, but
you had
yeah.
talked about, that it's a two-pronged process. You can't rely simply on, you know, a digital footprint, but then you have to follow up with in person. And it's not just with our elderly, but it is cross communities, right? That it is making sure that, you know, if there are other things happening in those other communities, we have to carve time to attend those particular protests to make sure that we are educated. There's some sense of, you know, commonality, right? To understand their plight, you know, not just, hey, you got to come to our protest in Chinatown, right? But never reciprocate. Okay. So we need to, you know, that's a lot of things for us to do. Okay. But this is the whole package, because otherwise you got different communities that are pitted against each other. So, you know, yes, there's a huge ton of work for us if we were to really do it right.
Thanks. I'm glad, you know, you brought up so many different traces of, it's about intergenerational, the use of technology. I also take Jan's point. My 80-plus-year-old parents they're constantly on WeChat in Chinese. And so in a lot of ways, the assumption that only young people use, you know, devices, I think is actually wrong-headed. But one of the things that's come up is that difference between face-to-face organizing and the efficiency, you could say, of putting out a call on social media and getting everybody into a physical space. And maybe I'll talk a little bit, ask you to talk a little bit more about the importance of physical space, because in the end, we're talking about Chinatowns as these physical locations and sites. And as much as a lot of the organizing tools that all you're talking about now, some can take place online, some, but is there something that's still, you know, you really want to be working together? I know Stephanie is about co-working spaces and things. Maybe I'll throw that out too. It's like, what are the ideal uses of actually Chinatown spaces for some of the organizing processes that you're talking about? I know that, again, Montreal, one of the wonderful things about yesterday is the launch of the physical space of a Chinatown house. But I want to throw that out as a way to think about what needs to be located in a face-to-face physical space process.
Yeah, maybe I'll just even back it up for us in Chinatown. I referenced earlier the fact that the police were called on 60 seniors who were just trying to do Tai Chi at a mall before opening hours. And this mall is actually owned by the city of Vancouver. So the city called the cops on seniors. So it's not a good look for any municipality whatsoever, but it makes you realize how limited space is for communities. And, you know, the seniors on their own wouldn't be able to, you know, fight through that city bureaucracy as we did for Fire Dragon Festival, for example, to get the permit in place, to be able to exercise there and to be able to, you know, obtain liability insurance. So all these things, all these barriers that communities have to go through just to be able to use their own space. You know, Chinatown is very short also on green space, and we have this huge soccer field adjacent to Chinatown. But what does that do for any of our seniors who want to outside, you know, practice Tai Chi or even just have gathering space? But to Henry's point, in terms of making sure that we coalition build, we are embarking on this process to build a co-share working space within our Chinatown with different organizations, ours with UBC and Hogan's Alley Society and Hua Foundation is on this call now. And I think it's important because there is that narrative in Chinatown amongst the older generation that wants to really erase the fact that there was a historic Black community. So for us, we want to be very intentional about saying that we want to partner with Hogan's Alley Society, but also keeping in mind that we don't want to weaponize that and put our neighbors in harm's way. Because at the end of the day, who is going to be harmed the most if something were to happen? It's going to be our brothers and sisters of color, and usually darker skinned coalition builders. So we have to be cognizant of that too, and that we're not weaponizing this and causing lateral harm really to our friends.
Thanks. Any other comments before I throw another? We have about 12 minutes left before. I think one of the other things that's come up, I've heard in terms of things that some of you have said and came up in the first panel, is the uh, the kind of ways in which organizing around race and versus a kind of class based, now again, there's for some of our listeners and for those joining, that's often been something that's pitted against each other. I know in particular for some of you, this is not at odds, but maybe we can talk a little bit about that in more in terms of where you've seen ways to counter that, and some suggestions for organizers that is it race or is it class? This has been historically a long time way of creating divisions.
I think.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Andrew.
Real quick,
Go ahead, Andrew.
because I looked at one of the questions from one of the audience about switching the name Chinatown to Tang community, which is one of the things that I actually engaged in with Salinas Chinatown, and I spoke to the organizers there. I said, look, knowing the specific history of Salinas, where it was a home for Chinese and then Japanese and then Chicanos and then even the homeless, right? Why not make it something, like Seattle, or rename it International District to have it be more welcoming? And it was surprising, the organizer that weren't just Chinese, but everybody else saying, no, but this is the historical name of this physical space. This name resonates with our memory, right? So we don't want to have something new, and we pass this on from one generation to the next. So we want to stay with that. So there is some sense of the cross, racial line that we're dealing with when we are actually working, with all these different groups. And so it's not like a one size fit all type of a formula. And you really need to engage with community members. You need to listen to them. And that's where I said, that sense of reciprocity comes back into play.
That's an excellent point, Andrew. Henry, there's an interesting discussion that's gone on here in Chinatown. We talk about open space. There's a park in our area called Sarah Roosevelt Park, and unfortunately, it has been inundated by the homeless and a lot of people who are openly using drugs. And so there's been a movement to try to to clean that up. And in so much as there's Asian Americans who are trying to clean up the park and get funding to improve the park, you find there's actually a person who happens to be white who lives around the park and who says, oh, all you want to do is gentrify the area to price us out. And the underlying subtext to that is Chinese people don't deserve nice parks. You should have a dirty, drug-infested park because I know better, because all you're trying to do is improve things to the point where I can't live here anymore. So you have to be careful about this idea of when we try to improve our neighborhoods from within, and we get criticized for doing that, the subtext there is you don't deserve to have nice things like other white neighborhoods or other neighborhoods that are more affluent. And how dare you try to improve your surroundings? And that's a very dangerous argument to be putting out there, that we absolutely have a right to improve our communities. We've been improving our communities since we've been here. But to now say that you've gotten to the point where we dictate what your improvement should be, that really opens up a very dangerous situation. In other words, there was another, I'd give you a totally different example, very high-end restaurants coming to Chinatown, and there were people in the community that was concerned about very high-end non-Chinese restaurants coming in because with liquor licenses, because at what point does it then become Chinatown in the future, if nothing is Chinese anymore? But there's other people who live in multi-million-dollar condominiums who say, I want to go there, I think it should be here, I have this viewpoint. but they literally are the 1%. The average income for a family in Chinatown is about $50,000 a year, and a lot of the other 1%ers is $500,000 a year. And ironically, they're the ones pushing for, I want to have a nicer restaurant that I can go to, but not really speaking for the other 99%. So very clearly, Henry, there's these class issues that get brought up, not necessarily around race, but around class. And I would add, yeah, go ahead, Stephanie.
Oh, sorry. Just going to say, again, back to that 105 Kiefer development, it's going to come up right against that Chinatown Memorial Plaza. So it's going to completely dwarf that monument that was, erected to honor our ancestors. And so, as this development was going through the permitting process board, all they had to do was really paint it red. And there you go. It was something, it looked Chinese enough for the community. And even people who were on the board, so city representatives saying things kind of like what you said, Jan, which is, this building is going to offer community amenities like restaurants to, again, bring in those warm bodies to fix Chinatown. So, of course we want a clean Chinatown. Of course we want a safe Chinatown, but that doesn't mean that that has to come through only serving that, again, 1%, like you mentioned.
Thanks. Faith. I'm sorry. I thought you were going to say something, but I'm not going to put you on the spot. We've got about 5 minutes, and I want to go to some of the. We've had lots of comments I've seen on the chat and things, but I just want to pull some, see if there's some questions from the audience to pull. I'm just looking through. I saw something about, sorry, I should have been paying
polling, I'll comment real quick that sometimes we fear what we are actually fighting for, because when we win particular battles, a new demographic through different types of gentrification comes in, right? You say, wait, how come a library never existed before, and now all of a sudden it comes in? Because all the new upper income folks, the professionals, demand to have a library, demand to have a garden, demand to have these particular spaces. And we have to pose these questions as to, well, how come these things never existed for us when we were disenfranchised? Why does it have to be created now when all of a sudden Karen moves in?
Thanks. Thanks for bringing that up, Andrew. And I think that's actually important, because in some sense, there is this false idea of fighting for Chinatowns, preserving it somehow in its quality.
Yeah. I will say that there is a new strategy for Chinese people who are questioning the influx of very high-end restaurants or bars coming into our Chinatowns who are not of our culture. The new technique now is to call us the racists. To say that, oh, you're just being a racist. That's not true. A lot of times these folks don't have the qualifications to operate with a full liquor license. They may have a questionable history in the other restaurants that they've run. And so this process about liquor licensing can be very complicated, but it's easy for the 1%ers to say, no, you're just racist. That diminishes this very complicated conversation, which really is a licensing issue that carries with it many nuanced qualifications of whether or not the community should grant a license, and then to use the accusation of racial bias against us because we're trying to protect our community. Because again, this is a health issue. A casino is a health issue. Alcoholism and bringing in the alcohol licenses into a saturation area is a health issue. So I find it ironic that the 1%ers who live in multi-million-dollar apartments who want to have that at their disposal anytime they want now call people who are trying to protect their community the racists. So there's a really deep irony there that this tool can be used against our own community by Chinese people.
But it really goes back to something that was discussed in the first panel. Right, that Chinatown is for those of us that are Asian Americans as well as other communities of color, right? But that for whiteness, it exists outside everywhere. Why do we need to add another luxury Italian, French restaurant in Chinatown? Okay.
Well, we actually asked that question. We part of our questioning when someone comes into Chinatown is, why do you want to be here? And it's a difficult thing that they stumble with when they answer you. And many people will say, well, because this is an area that has fresh produce, or this is an area that has an open plaza, or this is an area that was very much mom and pop restaurants. We have to be very careful that the real reason is not because you want to be a high-end place in contrast to poverty. And that oftentimes is the attraction, to use our community as the slumming background for very high-end food or drink. And so the bridge and tunnel and the people who are coming in sort of experience the exoticness of our faces and our community and our elderly and our children as the backdrop, as the exotification that we had to endure in the 1900s. And so you have to be very careful and scrutinize very carefully when people come in. Why are you coming here? You have the entirety of everything else outside of our community to exist within. What is the real reason you're here? The reason I say that is because there have been very high-end places that have come in, and all through their Instagram, they're taking pictures of people going about their daily lives because they're Chinese. Has nothing to do with their restaurant, has nothing to do with their food, has nothing to do with their drink. But the Instagram tells the entire story. We are just the backdrop for your substandard food that we produce better, that we have more authenticity behind, and you're just using us as a backdrop. So I think that through that lens, everything needs to be scrutinized very heavily.
Absolutely. Like, just even for Montreal, if you take a look at the website of the hotel that's right there at the gate, they have a photo, the gate, the hotel right next to it. But in the website, there's nothing about the mentioning of Chinatown, that we are in Chinatown. Okay. That's the last thing that they would want people to know, that where they are.
So thanks. Jan, Andrew, those were like good last words. And I'm cognizant that we're almost at this, but I want to give a chance to both Faiz and Stephanie, any kind of quick last words for you, to a point that you want everyone to make sure that they leave this panel remembering, because those ones I'm going to remember. So thanks to Jan and Andrew. Faiz, Stephanie.
Yeah, I'll just share. Similarly, in our Chinatown, or right next to our Chinatown, we have a new hospital being built. And so if you look at real estate listings for anything south of that hospital that's being built, really literally south of the railroad tracks that have bordered Chinatown, it's sold as a huge amenity, like walking distance to a brand new hospital facility. But no one in those communities is having discussions like we are having north of the tracks in Chinatown, in Strathcona, in the surrounding areas, about what kind of pressure is this going to put on the surrounding community? How is this going to exacerbate a housing crisis that we're already facing? We're already seeing it now as this hospital is being constructed. Workers who were being brought in from out of province, out of country to help build this hospital, great, but they are also taking up spaces in formerly known SROs, so single room occupancy housing, and really taking that away from the affordable housing market. So I think it's important that we think about, so-called community amenities, and, what are we actually getting out of it as a community, and how is it going to continue to potentially displace us and really not help us to create what I think Chinatowns are so great at, which is being this 15-minute neighborhood where you can access all these amenities and that really support this development of intergenerational community that supports its seniors, that really wants to see families thrive in this space. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. Faiz, any last words that you want to leave us with?
Well, I think Stephanie really expressed my energy. I feel like Chinatown in Montreal and more broadly are like models for informal and formal community organizing. I think that on the issue of like race versus class or whatever, I think that organizing around communities is probably the priority for me, because I feel like the class issue is a bit of a no-brainer. Like the ones who have the power are the ones who lose in a way the most, and they're the ones that I least would want to be like. And so there's no conflict for me on the class side. It's very clear. I think the work should be focused on building community with each other and within diversity in a way that's, really fun and inspiring.
Perfect last words. To sum up a really vibrant, rich conversation. Really want to thank you all, and on behalf of, I think, those who've been listening in too, to kind of give us so much to think about in terms of the challenges. The burnout, I think, is real. People who really, put their heart into organizing, fighting for Chinatown, fighting for communities, and I think maybe that's what we really got to at the end is the meaningfulness. The heart is about doing it not just for yourself, but for those you care about, whether it is seniors or whether it's other communities that have been vulnerable, who have suffered, at the hands of racism and colonial displacement. To not forget that really organizing around the heart is, in some sense, about organizing around community and a sense of community, and not leaving people out. And so, belonging in the end is the most important, and not excluding others in order to get what you think is the end. So again, I want to thank all of you for a wonderful discussion that I think has been inspiring to me, and I'm sure to a lot of those who have been listening in. We're going to go take a break between now and the next panel, but again, I want to give a symbolic online applause to all of you for sharing and for really inspiring us. Thanks.